And they allow you to hang your license? Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight. There's been a couple changes in our industry. So tonight we are going to be talking about the forms that have been either updated or implemented. So we're going to just jump right in and we're going to start covering the compensation agreement between brokers. Now, this is a document that should be created prior to any offers being written or received. So just keep that in mind. This is going to be a document that can be given by either the buyer's agent or the seller's agent. And like I mentioned, it should be given prior to, but within 10 days of an executed contract. So line one, the buyer or the tenant, because again, this is for rentals and for resale. Your ProSmart Realty goes here, your name goes here. If you have a team lead or just somebody that you work on a team with and they require to be on your documentation, put their name here. The seller should be auto-populated because you filled out your contacts and transaction desk, but if not, you can put the firm of the seller's agent here, for example, Varsity Homes, for example, and then an agent. Okay. Premises address should auto-populate. If it does not, put in the address, the assessor's number, city, county, zip code. Okay. From other training classes, you will know that we read these line by line, and I know it's boring, but one, it makes us read it, and two, every time I read something, I learn something new. So definitely a great practice. So bear with me. Terms and conditions. This agreement shall become effective when fully signed. That means that even if you're a buyer agent and you initiate it, it is not effective until the other opposing party, whether it be the buyer or the seller's agent, signs it. This agreement is contingent upon the fully signed agreement being delivered prior to or with an offer made by buyer to purchase or lease the premises. I know it says with. Technically, you can give it with, but it should be done prior to an offer being made. Buyer and seller entering into a purchase contract or lease for the premises within 10 days, or you can always extend that if your client maybe is out of town and they can't get back. Something, extending those days, you can put it in. You can even shorten it. Days of the seller broker signing this agreement, and if applicable, buyer closing escrow to purchase the premises pursuant to that purchase contract. Buyer broker compensation. Seller broker agrees to compensate buyer broker in accordance with the terms and conditions below. So when, never mind, different addendum. Check in any that apply and fill in the compensation. If it does not apply, you do not have to check it. So if it's a resale, you're going to check sale, and you're either going to put a % of the purchase price or a specific dollar amount or something other. Compensation to buyer broker is earned and payable when buyer or any entity owned or controlled by the buyer closes escrow on a purchase or exchange of the premises. The buyer broker presents buyer in such transaction as indicated on the purchase contract. Any escrow or closing agent may pay buyer broker's compensation from seller's broker's compensation at close of escrow. If it is a lease, like a rental, then you would not check line 15, you would check line 19. And that is a gross rental amount as calculated for the entire term of the initial lease, or certain amount like 150, 500, 750, whatever it might be. The compensation to buyer broker is earned and payable when buyer or any entity owned or controlled by the buyer or seller execute a lease agreement for the premises. Questions so far on compensation? It is clear, precise. It is what it is. This cannot be changed. Remedies. Alternative dispute resolution. Buyer broker and seller broker agreed to mediate any dispute or claim arising out of or relating to this agreement. All mediation costs shall be paid equally by the parties. In the event the mediation does not resolve all disputes or claims, the unresolved disputes or claims shall be submitted for binding arbitration pursuant to the most recent version of the Code of Ethics and Arbitration Manual published by the AAR. Judgment on the award rendered by the arbitration panel may be entered in any court of competent jurisdiction. Additional current terms and conditions. You know, we're able to pretty much make any terms and conditions. And we can put it here as long as both parties agree to it. What those terms and conditions are, I couldn't tell you. But the option to put it is here. Assignment, neither seller broker nor buyer broker may assign any rights or obligations pursuant to this agreement without the prior written consent of the other, and any attempt assignment without consent shall be void and of no effect. All other contracts follow Arizona law. This agreement shall be governed by Arizona law, and jurisdiction is exclusively conferred to the state of Arizona. Copies and counterparts. This agreement may be executed by facsimile or other electronic means in any number of counterparts. A fully executed facsimile or electronic copy of this agreement shall be treated as an original agreement. Just meaning that one person can sign multiple copies of this agreement. And once brought together, it forms one document. Entire agreement, this agreement and any addenda and attachment shall constitute the entire agreement between the parties, shall pursuant any other written or oral agreements, and can only be modified in a writing signed by the parties. Invalidity or unenforceability of one or more provisions of this agreement shall not affect any other provisions of this agreement. Buyer broker information goes here. Seller broker information goes here. This is not made part of the contract. That is the main difference between this document and the seller compensation addendum. This is just between the brokers. This is basically exactly what we were doing in the past, but now we are putting it in writing and not advertising it on the MLS. Questions about this addendum? Or form, I should say. It's not really an addendum. Okay. Moving on. Seller compensation addendum. This is probably the form that ProSmart will be not pushing, but asking you to use, because it really is the best form to negotiate your compensation. And the key word is negotiate, because it is negotiable. It is made part of the contract, and we all know that everything in a contract can be negotiated. Question by Shane, does it seem it would be more common that a selling agent would send this over to a buyer agent during initial conversations? You know, Shane, I don't know, because it's a new form. I can tell you though that I had someone reach out on one of my listings asking me to show the home. I texted them and I said, thank you for your showing. My seller is willing to compensate the buyer's agent 2.5%. They then in turn initiated this compensation agreement between brokers, sent it to me, I signed it, and I sent it back. So in that case, the buyer's agent initiated it, but it really could be either side. You are more than welcome. Okay, so we're going to go over why this form is probably the best practice, and which is why our broker, Mike, has decided that this is the one that we should be using. So it states who it was originated by, whether it was the seller or the buyer. Typically, it's going to be the buyer because we're the ones submitting the offer. This is an addendum to the contract lease agreement dated, whatever is the last date of either the purchase contract or a counter offer between the following parties, the buyer and the seller, or the tenant and the landlord. Premises address. The following additional terms and conditions are hereby included as part of the contract or lease agreement between seller and buyer for the above referenced premises. Seller shall pay broker representing buyer compensation as follows. So if it's 3%, or if you're asking for 3%, or a specific dollar amount. This would have been so handy if we could have seen it in the MLS, but that is gone. So now, unless you've had a previous conversation with the buyer's agent, you just put in what you want to be compensated. Now, keep in mind that if this seller compensation is lower than what you have on your buyer broker agreement, you do not get those excess funds. So if the seller is only willing to pay you 2.5%, but your buyer broker is for 3%, that other 0.5% for the buyer broker goes to the buyer, not you. And we will go over that in detail. So, put in what you want to be paid. If it's a lease, of course, put in the percent or a dollar amount, once it closes. This compensation is key. This is a very important line. This compensation is in addition to any seller concession credited to buyer in the contract, if applicable. This is huge because this states that this is for your compensation and it has nothing to do with any seller concessions to pay for repairs or to buy down the rate. It's specifically for your compensation. Check if applicable. Pursuant to a separate written agreement, seller broker has agreed to compensate buyer broker in the amount of a percent of the full purchase price or whatever written amount, which is independent of and in addition to the compensation in this addendum. So this would be, let's say you're doing a new build and it's a spec home, the builder's trying to push it. So they're offering you an additional 1% commission. You could put that here and you could put this with your offer. Keep in mind though, you have to refer back to your buyer broker because if the compensation on your buyer broker is less than, I'm sorry, if it is more than what the seller is willing to pay you, it goes to the buyer. Could you have the buyer do a new buyer broker agreement? Sure. But you have to be very clear in why you're asking for more. And a new build, it's a perfect example. If they're just offering a bonus to the agent that, sells his home, sure. Just have that conversation with them. It is going to be extremely rare when this happens, but it could happen. This addendum provides the undersigned written consent for buyer broker to receive compensation from more than one party of the transaction. This line, 17 and 18, states that if the seller's only willing to compensate the buyer's agent 2.5%, they're going to pay 2.5% to the buyer's agent, the seller is. If your buyer broker states 3%, that line 17 and 18 is stating that even though you're getting compensation from the seller, you can still get compensation from the buyer per the buyer broker agreement because it was 3% where the seller's only paying you 2.5%. So now you're getting commission from two people. Does that make sense? Okay, perfect. Seller and buyer explicitly intend brokers to be direct third-party beneficiaries of the contract and or lease agreement pursuant to this addendum and either Section 8F or Section 9G of the contract. The provisions of this addendum shall survive close of escrow. Additional terms and conditions, I don't know what to put here, if anything. This is also new to all of us, but as we go through the motions and we get used to doing it, future training classes, I might have some examples for you. I just don't have any at this time. The undersigned agrees to the terms and conditions set forth above and acknowledges receipt of the copy hereof. So again, seller compensation addendum is filled out and submitted with your offer, and you check, the section of the purchase contract where you check the addendums that are made part of the contract, like HOA, lead-based paint, fire contingency. There's now a seller compensation addendum that you can check. So that makes it a part of the contract. If you accidentally forget to check it, not a huge deal. You just do an addendum stating that it is to be checked. But this should be submitted with every single offer you do, because this is going to be your way to get paid. If you don't put this in the contract, you are stating that the buyer is paying your commission. So it would be a very costly mistake. I think that in the beginning, we're going to see leniency, but don't count on it. We're professionals. We should know how to do our paperwork. So just make sure that you are double checking. And if you ever need to send an offer to me to review prior, please do. I'm happy to put extra eyes on it. Or hire Dale. She's amazing at doing paperwork, and it's very inexpensive. Questions on seller compensation addendum? Okay. There are going to be 2 buyer broker agreements that we are going to go over tonight. And we're going to start with what we call the dating addendum or agreement. So this is the buyer broker agreement to show a property. And I think when we were in class, this was it was confusing people. I like to also say this is the a la carte. If somebody wants to hire an agent just to go show them homes, this is the form you want to use. It's a la carte. I'm not hiring you. I just want you to open doors for me. Again, you're dating the person. You're not married to them. So this is not between me and another agent. It's not where I go on vacation and I have, one of my girls from the group of girls that we have, Tina Harrison, say, hey, Tina, can you show me this? Can you show my clients this property? I do not need this agreement. Should I have it? Probably, but I don't need it because it's between the same broker. This is just stating between a buyer and a broker. So buyer name, broker's name, agent's name, team name, if you have a team lead. Notice that the buyer all realtors are required to have a signed written agreement prior to showing a home to a buyer. Buyer engages broker for the purpose of viewing property and providing other real estate services at broker's discretion. That may include contract negotiation and advocacy services throughout a real estate transaction. This has a begin and an end date. So like all contracts, there's a begin and a clear beginning and a clear ending date. The property, the buyer instructs broker to locate and show property meeting the following general description: residential, land, commercial, other. Agency. The agency relationship between broker and buyer determines how broker will work on buyer's behalf and will be documented in the real estate agency disclosure and election form. So you also want to get that form signed too. That form hasn't changed. It's changed back in April. I don't remember when it changed. Maybe it was February. So that one hasn't changed. So you do want to have them sign not only this, but also that if we're going to go show them houses. Broker compensation is not set by law, nor by any board, association of realtors, multi-listing services, or in any manner other than as fully negotiated between the broker and the buyer in this agreement. Broker compensation: if broker represents the buyer in the purchase of the property as indicated on the purchase contract that was signed prior to the expiration date, buyer agrees to compensate broker as follows. I'm going to reread that. If broker represents buyer in the purchase of a property as indicated on a purchase contract that was signed prior to the expiration date, the buyer agrees to compensate broker as follows. So you put 3% in here. So you're showing them houses, you put an offer in. This is still in effect. It hasn't expired. Their contract gets accepted. You get paid, and you want to put that percentage in here. It could also just be a dollar amount or another. Broker compensation shall be due and paid at the time of and as a condition of close of escrow. Buyer authorizes broker to accept compensation from seller or seller's broker, which shall be credited against broker compensation. Broker will not receive any amount greater than broker compensation from any source for services provided in this agreement. Buyer showing instructions. Brokers shall show properties listings that fit buyer's criteria regardless of compensation offered to a broker by seller or seller's broker unless instructed otherwise by a buyer in writing. Meaning, if your buyer does not want to see a house that is not offering to pay a buyer's agent, get it in writing. If necessary, buyer instructs broker to negotiate broker compensation to be paid by seller or seller's broker. These negotiations shall not jeopardize, delay, or interfere with the initiation, processing, or finalizing of a transaction. That hasn't changed. It's always been like that, so. As always, equal fair housing opportunity. Broker's policy is to abide by all local, state, federal laws prohibiting discrimination against any individual or group of individuals. For more information, see Fair Housing Advisory. Acceptance. Buyer hereby agrees to all the terms, conditions herein and acknowledges receipt of the copy of this agreement. Buyer signs it and agent signs it. So here's my thoughts on this. Maybe I'll have a person that doesn't want to work with me and this is a better form, but I will always tell them, chances are if you and I are working together and you don't like me or you don't feel like I'm the right agent for you, chances are I don't like you either. And I don't want to continue working with you. So I would rather have a marriage and then get a divorce than have somebody go out and cheat on me, because that is exactly what this form does, in my opinion. It is stating, hey, I know you're going to use me, but you can also use somebody else. Where the other form says that you are committed to me, you're not going to go cheat on me because we're married. And if it doesn't work, then it doesn't work. We do a quick addendum. I don't know what yet, which one that would be, but ending the relationship. It's plain and simple. This doesn't protect me. This does not say that I'm going to be the one getting paid, because what if my name doesn't go on that contract? So use it, don't use it, completely up to you. I have confidence in my ability to help clients, and I'm going to just go straight forward with the employment agreement. And I'm going to explain that to them because, hey, if you don't like me, great. No worries, no pressure. Like, we can end this. Any questions? What works for me doesn't always work for you. So please, whatever works for you, or use this until you get the hang of it, whatever it might be, just always know that there's no one way or a right way in real estate when it comes to the buyer broker agreement. Make sense? Cool. Okay. Oops, darn it. Clicked the wrong one. So this is required. Oh, it is required, Shane. Yes. You have to have a buyer broker exclusive employment agreement or the buyer broker to show properties. So you have to have one or the other. You don't have a choice anymore. The only thing that someone doesn't have a choice for is if they go to an open house. They are not required to sign any documentation when they go to an open house. And I think that a lot of people have been pushing that, and that is not the case. You do not have to have that form. Close down your open house, then show them the house and get a form signed. Absolutely. But you do not have to do that at an open house. I also heard that new builds are requiring buyers to sign this form. They do not have to sign that form. This is more reason for us to get out there and have our voices be heard, is saying they are trying to get you to be unrepresented. This is why you bring an agent with you, because then you have somebody who's fighting for you, representing you. So keep trying to have them sign that, new builds, because it only works in our benefit. Alrighty, let's see. Next, buyer broker exclusive employment agreement. I love this form. Never used it until the first. Because at that time I did not want somebody to feel that they had to use me. But now I'm like all for it and I love it. Okay. Buyer name goes here, broker's name here, agent, and of course, if you have a team lead, it goes here. The agreement. The buyer-broker exclusive employment agreement is between a buyer and a broker. In consideration of the broker's agreement to assist the buyer locate, negotiate, facilitate the purchase of a property. Buyer gives broker exclusive and irrevocable right to represent the buyer in the purchase of a property during this term. You can make this document as short as you want, or this agreement as short as you want, or as long as you want. I don't think it can be more than a year, though. I could be wrong on that. Buyer acknowledges that signing more than one buyer-broker exclusive employment agreement or similar agreements could make the buyer liable to compensate multiple brokers. So make sure that you inform them of that. You are married to me. You cannot go out and cheat because it will cost you. Term, this agreement starts on and expires on a clear start and end date. Employment, broker agrees to A, locate property meeting the following general descriptions. Check all that apply. Unless you are versed well in commercial, I don't recommend dipping your toes in it. We've got Phyllis here at ProSmart. She's amazing at commercial and she does pay a referral fee. Do your client justice and refer instead of trying to tackle it. I've tried. It is a beast, not fun. Not that our broker doesn't encourage us, but you know, we want to do what's best for our clients. Within the following geographical areas, I would put the state of Arizona because you are licensed in the state of Arizona. I could be wrong. I'll check with broker Mike, but that's what I would put. Negotiate a buyer's direction to obtain acceptable terms and conditions for the purchase, exchange, or option of the property. Assist buyer during the transition within scope of buyer's expertise and licensing. Again, going back to the commercial. If you're not an expert, probably not a good idea to do it. Agency relationship. The agency relationship between buyer and broker shall be as set forth in the real estate agency disclosure and election form. Again, just like the other form, you want to get that form signed. I am going to ask broker Mike, though, if they sign the buyer broker to show properties, do they need the agency form? I feel like they should get it, but I don't know if it's necessary.
Because if they write an offer on the other one, you're.
Yeah. So I'm going to double check. I would get it just to have it because, again, extra protection for you as the agent, and also, you know, just I would just get it, but I will confirm. I don't know if it's necessary because otherwise, why wouldn't they have this on that form is what I'm thinking. Property viewings, buyer agrees to work exclusively with broker and be accompanied by broker on buyer's first visit to any property. If broker does not accompany buyer on the first visit of any property, including a model home, new home, lot, or open house held by the builder, seller, or other real estate broker, buyer acknowledges that the builder, seller, or seller's broker may refuse to compensate the broker, which will eliminate any credit against the agreed upon broker compensation below. Doesn't mean that they don't owe you, because they do per this agreement. Buyer agrees to review the Arizona Department of Real Estate Buyer Advisory to assist in buyer's inspections and investigations. So if you are not already in the habit of providing the buyer advisory up front, get in the habit of that, get it signed, save a copy of it. Broker compensation is not set by law, nor in any board, association of realtors, multi-listing services, or in any manner other than fully negotiate between the broker and the buyer of this agreement. Buyer initials. Retainer fee. Check if applicable. If it doesn't, don't check it. Buyer agrees to pay a broker. I'm going to uncheck that because it actually, I don't require it. But if I did, if I was going to do a non-refundable retainer fee, I'd put that amount, I would check that, and it would be due within 5 days of execution of this agreement, which is earned when paid for initial consultation, research, and other services. And this fee shall or shall not be credited against the broker's compensation below. I don't know any agents that charge a retainer fee. You can, but you know, it's up to you. I don't know a buyer that would pay it. Broker compensation if buyer or any entity owned or controlled by buyer closes escrow on a transaction for the purpose, exchange, or option of a property, buyer agrees to compensate broker as follows. I love how this is worded, and I will explain it. It is very detailed of who they owe and what they're gonna owe and when they're gonna owe it. So, I am going to do 3% of the purchase price on all of my buyer brokers. That is just how I'm gonna do it. I can adjust my commission, which I would anyways. If the seller was only offering 2.5, that's just me. Or am I gonna just charge a specific dollar amount? I think we're gonna see some people going, oh, don't worry, I just charged $3,000. Work with me. No matter the home price, 3,000, that's it. And I don't think that's the best practice, but to each his own. The broker compensation shall be in US currency and paid at the time of and as a condition of closing for purchase or exchange or as otherwise agreed upon in writing. Compensation from seller or seller's broker. A seller or seller's broker may offer compensation to broker. Buyer authorizes broker to accept compensation from seller or seller's broker, which shall be credited against the broker compensation. If seller or seller's broker offers of compensation is greater than the broker compensation, broker shall be paid the broker compensation and the balance shall be credited to the buyer to the extent allowed by the buyer's lender. So make sure that is explained. Broker will not receive any amount greater than broker compensation from any source or services provided in this agreement. So if the seller is willing to pay 3%, but your buyer broker is only 2.5%, you're out of luck. That goes to the buyer. Like I mentioned, could you renegotiate and ask the buyer sign a new one so you could get full compensation? Sure. But I'd be a buyer going, well, what about me? Why don't I get something out of this? Well, I don't know. Maybe you can't because you're already maxed out because we got you 6% and FHA says you can only get 6%. So why let that money go to waste? Help a sister out. If seller or seller's broker offers compensation is less than the broker compensation, the buyer may request seller to pay the broker compensation as part of the offer to purchase property, aka seller concession. Any broker compensation not paid by seller or seller's broker shall be paid by the buyer. Or you can do a commission adjustment before closing, send it to all parties, and then your buyer, then your compensation would just be reduced to whatever they are offering to pay. Again, best practice, whatever you want to do. Notice, unless modified by VA regulations, VA finance transactions shall be conditioned upon the broker compensation being paid by the seller or the seller's broker. So if I'm reading this correctly, the VA cannot pay for the vet cannot pay. Yes, I can email it to you after class, Ashley. Failure to complete. Once an acceptable property is located, buyer agrees to act in good faith to acquire the property and conduct any inspections, investigations of the property that buyer deems material or important. If completion of any transaction is prevented by buyer's breach or with the consent of buyer other than as provided in the purchase contract, the broker compensation shall be due and payable by the buyer. Compensation after the expiration date. After the expiration date of this agreement, buyer agrees to pay broker compensation within X amount of days after the expiration date. If the buyer enters into an agreement to purchase, exchange, or option any property known or negotiated by the broker on behalf of the buyer during the term of this agreement, or the buyer closes escrow on a property pursuant to a purchase contract that was executed during the term of this agreement, or buyer closes escrow on a property for which escrow was opened during the term of this agreement. You can put 30 days, 60 days, and 90 days. It's going to, like before, it's going to be hard to prove that you are the procuring cause. And I think that the whole reason for these forms is to get rid of that. So I just think it just makes it a little bit more difficult, but you could put a date in there. I just put 30 days because who knows? Listings. Broker shall show property listings that fit the buyer's criteria regardless of the compensation offered by broker, by seller, or seller's broker unless instructed otherwise by buyer in writing. If necessary, buyer instructs broker to negotiate broker compensation to be paid by seller or seller's broker, which I don't know why we wouldn't do that for our clients in the, regardless, but of course it's a contract, you got to put it in there. These negotiations shall not jeopardize, delay, or interfere with the initiation, processing, or finalizing of a transaction. If buyer decides they do not wish to view properties unless the seller or seller's broker has offered adequate compensation to the broker, the buyer must make that instruction to broker in writing. Get it in writing. Don't open yourself up to a lawsuit. Equal housing opportunity. Broker's policy is to abide by all local, state, and federal laws prohibiting discrimination against any individual or group of individuals. Broker may not disclose the racial, ethnic, or religious composition of any neighborhood, community, or building, nor whether persons with disabilities are housed in any home or facility, except that broker may identify housing facilities meeting the needs of a disabled buyer. For more information, consult Fair Housing Advisory. Other potential buyers. Buyer consents and acknowledges that other potential buyers represented by the broker may consider, make offers on, or acquire an interest in the same or similar properties the buyer is seeking. Release of the broker. Buyer recognizes, acknowledges, and agrees that broker is not qualified nor licensed to offer advice on financial, legal, or tax matters regarding real estate transactions. Broker, if requested, may provide buyer the names of third-party professionals who claim to perform related services. Buyer is instructed to independently investigate all potential third-party professionals and use their sole discretion in selecting which third-party professionals to hire, if any. Buyer exclusively releases, holds harmless, and indemnifies broker from any and all liability and responsibility regarding buyer's selection and use of third-party professionals to perform related services or buyer's election not to use services on such third-party professionals. Initial. Again, I don't have any examples at this moment for additional terms and conditions. This actually would be a great place to put that the buyer has instructed the buyer's agent to not show them homes that are not offering compensation to be paid by the seller or the seller's agent. Alternative dispute, that is the same as all others. So, it goes to mediation. And then if you don't agree, then it goes to the American Arbitration Association. Same process as always. The parties agree that any and all disputes or claims that are brought in the party's individual capacity and not as a plaintiff or class member in any purported class, collective, representative, or any consolidated proceedings. The parties hereby waive the right to commence, become a party to, or remain a participant in any group, representative, class, collective, or hybrid class collection action, and any proceedings, and the arbitrator shall not proceed over any form of group, representative, or class collective proceedings. Initial. Attorney costs and fees. In any non-realtor association proceedings to enforce the compensation due to broker pursuant to this agreement, the prevailing party shall be awarded their reasonable attorney fees and arbitration costs. Again, like our other forms, Arizona law, this agreement shall be governed by Arizona law, and jurisdiction is exclusively conferred on the state of Arizona. Copies and counterparts. This agreement may be executed by facsimile or other electronic means, and any other number of other counterparts. A fully executed facsimile or electronic copy of this agreement shall be treated as an original agreement. This agreement and any addenda and attachments shall constitute the entire agreement between buyer and broker and shall supersede any other written or oral agreements between buyer and broker, and can be modified only by writing signed by buyer and broker. Invalidity or enforceability of one or more provisions of this agreement shall not affect any other provisions of the agreement. Capacity. Buyer warrants that buyer has a legal capacity, full power, and authority to enter into this agreement and consummate this transaction contemplated hereby on buyer's own behalf or on behalf of a party buyer represents as appropriate. Acceptance, buyer hereby agrees to all terms and conditions herein and acknowledges receipt of the copy of this agreement. Buyer's information, buyer signs, our information goes here and we sign. Any questions? Perfect. Okay, next. Well, because this is a training class, I'm quickly going to show you on the contract. Right here, line 37, seller compensation, that should be checked on all your offers. And the seller compensation has to be included in your offer. Let's look at the unrepresented buyer disclosure. I think I might have that under my seller. So you've got a listing, you're representing the seller. And we're probably going to see this quite often. A buyer doesn't want to pay compensation and they think that they're going to get a better deal if they just go through you as the agent. Well, that's great and all, but I'm not going to take on the responsibility and all that comes with that without you signing this form. So if you have a buyer that does not have an agent, that's okay, but they need to sign this form. And this form states that seller broker informed unrepresented buyer of their right to hire a buyer broker who would represent only them. However, unrepresented buyer has elected to not be represented by a buyer broker in the purchase of the premises and acknowledges the following. The seller broker only represents the seller in the sale of this premises and does not represent unrepresented buyer. Seller broker will communicate with unrepresented buyer, may provide them with transaction documents, and may conduct other activities to accomplish the sale of the premises. However, all such activities are performed solely on behalf of the seller to facilitate a successful sale of their premises and not for the benefit of the unrepresented buyer and does not create an agency relationship. The real estate agency disclosure and election form, unrepresented buyer should review and sign a read whatever form acknowledging that the seller broker only represents the seller and not the unrepresented buyer. Fiduciary duties to the seller. Seller broker owes fiduciary duties to the seller of loyalty, obedience, disclosure, confidentiality, and accounting. Because seller broker has a duty to disclose information to the seller, the unrepresented buyer should not disclose any confidential information to seller broker who is obligated to convey the information to the seller. Even though they're unrepresented, the seller broker shall be honest and truthful to the unrepresented buyer and deal fairly with them. However, the duty to deal fairly does not include giving advice to an unrepresented buyer on the steps they should take to protect their own interests. Provide interpretation. I'm horrible at reading, guys. Interpretation of contract terms or notify them of deadlines. Unrepresented buyer acknowledges that statements made by seller have not been independently verified by seller broker, and seller broker is not responsible for seller's representations. Due diligence. The unrepresented buyer acknowledges it is their responsibility to protect their own interests and are encouraged to hire their own professional to advise them in matters of real estate, inspection, contract timelines, financing, zoning, law, tax, insurance, or any other areas they deem appropriate to assist them in purchasing the premises. Unrepresented buyer assumes all risk should they choose not to hire a professional to assist them in purchasing the premises. All parties sign. Well, actually just the unrepresented buyer. And again, this is only if they don't have an agent. Okay. I think the last form that we are going to be reviewing tonight, and it will not be a full review of it because again, we've reviewed this document. I'm only reviewing the changes. And that is the residential listing contract exclusive right to sell. A lot of it is the same, so I'm just going to go to the area that is not the same. So hold on, we have a question. If that buyer makes offer and it is accepted, are you eligible for any? Well, now, Shane, you're ahead of me, so just give me one moment. So like previous exclusive rights to sell, it has a clear begin and an end date. So you put your purchase price, put an end and a start date, and then here comes that good old compensation. So previously this was updated and it added listing broker compensation is not set by law, nor in any board, association of realtors, multi-listing service, or in any manner other than as fully negotiated between the listing broker and the owner of this agreement. Should the owner choose to offer compensation to a buyer broker or a tenant broker, the offered amount is also fully negotiable and agreed upon after discussion with the listing broker. Okay, so owner agrees to compensate listing broker and other broker, if any, as follows. Again, if you want to charge a retainer, you can put that here. Listing broker compensation, if listing broker produces a ready, willing, and able buyer or tenant in accordance to this agreement, or if a sale or rental of the property is made by owner or through any other broker or otherwise during the term of this agreement, owner agrees to pay listing broker compensation of whatever it might be. So here's where the changes start coming in. Additional listing broker compensation. Shane, here's the answer to your question. If an unrepresented buyer comes, the owner agrees to pay the listing broker additional compensation of, why not get the full compensation? So now you're getting paid 6 because you're taking on more risk. Essentially, I mean, that document should protect you, but nonetheless, you're taking on more risk. You're doing more work. You know, you could put 2%, you can put 5, whatever, not 5, but 2, 1, whatever. So now you're getting 3% and 2%. And here's what they're willing to pay the buyer broker. It used to be, this would say 5% or whatever, 6%. And of that, we would pay the buyer broker, but that's not how it is anymore. Now it reads, no matter what, the listing broker is getting 3%. If a non-represented buyer comes in, the listing broker gets a 3 and the 2. And on top of that, they're going to pay a buyer broker. Owner authorizes listing broker to communicate an offer of compensation to a prospective buyer broker and the amount of. So right now, if I get the listing and I have an unrepresented buyer, it's going to cost the seller 5%. If I get the listing and a buyer broker brings me a buyer, the seller's paying 6%. Does that make sense? Yeah, you check this. And this one.
You do check both.
Oh, for sure.
Is there?
Yeah. So if I'm going to not only represent the seller, but also do all the work that it's going to come with typing up a contract, negotiating it, everything for the unrepresented buyer, why not get paid for it? Before, that was not in any documentation. You didn't get paid. In fact, I don't even think we would take an unrepresented buyer because of the risk. We would refer them out to another agent or ask them to get representation. Owner's authorization includes consent to the listing broker to enter an agreement with the prospective buyer broker to compensate the broker if they represent the buyers of the premises. In such circumstances, owner shall provide listing broker the funds necessary to pay the agreed upon buyer broker compensation not to exceed the offer amount. Owner shall also pay listing broker the offer amount as additional compensation if any agent of a listing broker represents the buyer of the premises. Owner acknowledges that the buyer broker represents the interest of the buyers and not the interest of the owner in a transaction unless the agent of a listing broker represent both the owner and the buyer, and then a limited representation comes in. If it's a rental, then you would do the same thing down here. I love this. I can't tell you how many times I have to just take 3% versus the full 6 because I feel bad because they don't have an agent and I don't want to charge my client. But now this clearly states, hey, if they don't have an agent, I'm going to get paid for it. I'll reduce it, but I'm still going to get paid for it because I'm doing the work. So I love this change. Everything else, to my understanding, is exactly the same. That was the only update, if I'm not mistaken. Any questions on exclusive listing, contract, exclusive right to sell? I can't hear you, so if you have any questions, you do have to type it out. Sorry, for some reason, my computer does it every once in a while, but if you have a question on the material that we covered tonight, please let me know. I am going to, oh, somebody left. Dang it. I wanted to, can I still see who did that chat though? Ashley is. Okay, perfect. I am just gonna make sure that I covered everything that was on the flyer tonight. I believe I did. Yes, 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 yes. Oh, listing contract addendum, that was on there. Okay. Let's cover that real quick. So if you have not done so, make sure you watch the video that Dale and broker Mike sent out. This listing contract addendum is going to replace the sold change form because it does everything that we need that did, and this is more updated. So if you need to change your broker compensation and you're not already under contract, you change it on here. Otherwise, it is done with the commission adjustment form. The term, if you need to expire it right away. Other modified and additional terms, you could put that here. If they're canceling the listing, you can now check one of these boxes. Before you had to just put in that they're canceling it and it is effective, you know, such and such. So this is the new form that you will use. It's going to replace the sold change form, which I love because that means, I believe, that we don't have to use that form if we make little adjustments. Any questions about tonight? I know it was a lot of information. If you would like me to email it to you, please don't hesitate to reach out. It does take a little bit for it to actually upload into the system, but I'm happy to do it. Thank you so much for coming tonight. If you have any questions after class, do not hesitate to stay around and ask. Thank you so much for coming. Have a great week.